Eric was 8 years old, he told his therapist, "I wish that I could start my life all over at 8 and have a mom that makes good decisions and have a man that I can call my father." 8 years old. That's a second grader. That is a child saying, "I am not okay. I am not safe." Eric never knew his father, and he had a mother who made nothing but bad decisions. I'm going to tell you a bit about Eric's life, and as I do, I'm asking you to think about what this little boy's life was like. What was his actual lived experience day to day? Eric cannot count the number of homes he lived in. His records reflect multiple men he referred to as daddy or stepdad. He routinely slept on the floor, ate spoiled food, wore dirty clothes to school. He watched his mother's boyfriends hit her. He saw his mother and her friends use drugs. When he was in his mother's care, he never started and finished the school year in the same school. This is not just a list of events. This is a way of living that was profoundly altering of his brain and bodily function. We can talk about data. We can talk about the sheer number of adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, this little boy had. And Dr. Oyen's going to talk about what those are. And this is important because there's proof. There is scientific research telling us that these things change children's brains. And while they're not a checklist, Eric does check every single one of the ACEs boxes, which is incredibly rare. Each one of these things that happened to Eric Sweeney was part of a devastating, cascading series of events, and each one of these things damaged his brain and damaged his psyche. When Eric was a baby, his aunt walked into his house and found him in a car seat in a room filled with crack smoke. When Eric was 18 months old, his mom temporarily gave guardianship to her parents because she was being investigated by DCYF regarding her care for another sibling. No one ever checked to see if his mother's home or her parents' home was actually safe for that toddler, Eric. When Eric was 4 years old, he was sexually abused by a man his mother was dating. And sometimes, respectfully, I think we use the term sexual abuse and we glaze over it in our minds. Those of us who work in the court system see these cases day in and day out, sadly. But I ask you to take a moment and think about a 4-year-old child left in a room by a mother with an adult, told he's supposed to trust this person, and that adult sucked on his penis. Think of the confusion that child experienced. Think of the pain when he realizes as he grows older that this is not normal, this was not okay. The anger that he experienced as he grew older and realized this man was never held accountable. When Eric was 5 years old, his kindergarten teacher reported his clothing was dirty, it was too small, his sneakers were separated from his soles, he never had a backpack. She couldn't reach his mother. When Eric was 6 years old, he slept on the floor in an apartment that stunk of urine. He stood on the street corner and asked passersby to give him money for food. When Eric was 7 years old, his mom gave guardianship to family friends, supposedly because she was ill, but really because she had to serve jail time. That family reported Eric would hit his own head and say, "I want this stuff to get out of my head." While he lived with this other family, Eric went to therapy for the first time. He forged a connection with his therapist. He had a safe space to express his anger and his confusion as his mom disappeared and reappeared over and over and over. He confided that her boyfriend was abusive and mean, that he was scared. He said he wanted to stay with his guardians where he felt safe. He told that therapist, "I wish I had a normal mom like you." And Eric made progress. His behavior improved. until he got pulled back into his mother's orbit. As his mother's visitation increased, as she kept increasingly talking about taking him back, his behavior worsened. And when Eric was 9 years old, his mother regained custody. She took him for an intake at a mental health service office. And at the very first appointment, she had a seizure. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She passed out. When she woke up, she was incoherent. She couldn't stand. The therapist was understandably concerned that this was drug-related and called DCYF. And nothing happened. They investigated. They closed the case. But he didn't see that therapist for very long, just a few sessions. And he told the therapist his mother had warned him, "Don't say anything. She'll tell the state." When Eric was 10 years old, he told yet another therapist that his mom wanted to leave her abusive boyfriend. But he was worried about this because where will we live? That's not a concern a 10-year-old boy should have. Well, that same therapist wanted to engage in something called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy with Eric. She wanted to try to repair some of the damage that he'd already suffered. And she told his mom it was really important to bring him in regularly. She agreed. Eric had one session. One. When Eric was 11 years old, he and his mother were homeless again. His mother described him as continually filthy. His school described him as continually filthy and exhausted. Sean and Kassandra Sweeney arranged with his mom to take Eric for a few months while she went down to Florida to see family. But at the last moment, his mother reneged on the deal. She took Eric down to Florida with her. There was yet another DCYF investigation open at the time, but it closed as she moved to Florida. Down in Florida, Eric lived in an old, moldy camper next door to his aunt's. His mom and her boyfriend frequently disappeared for days at a time, using meth, crack, fentanyl. He never knew when she would come back. Each of these events, these vignettes in Eric's life, these are life-altering, brain-altering experiences. Eric was repeatedly neglected and abused by the adults in his life. This kind of persistent neglect and abuse changes how a child's brain develops. It does deep psychological damage. At every turn, Eric was failed by the adults who were supposed to protect him. Out of his mother's 7 children, he was the only one who stayed in her custody. The only one. Over and over again, concerned adults contacted New Hampshire DCYF. And over again, DCYF closed cases as unfounded and left Eric in his mother's care. In June of 2019, Eric was 12 years old, almost 13. He saw his older brother Sean and his wife Kassandra at a funeral. Eric walked around the funeral, underfed, dirty, greasy hair, wearing torn and outgrown clothes, asking any responsible adult he could find to take him in. Sean and Kassandra said yes. They were only 22 years old. Eric told us his happiest memory was going into his school principal's office, seeing Sean standing there and hearing him say, "You're coming home with me." Eric screamed so loudly the principal told him, "You're going to make me deaf." And when Sean and Kassandra took him in, they wanted to help him. They did everything they could. They took him to the doctor. They took him to the dentist. They contacted the area mental health agency. But as time went on, they began to fear that Eric was more than they could handle because he was deeply damaged. This 12-year-old boy was deeply impaired by attachment issues. He'd suffered a lifetime of neglect and a deep trauma history that had yet to be comprehensively treated. And he'd started that journey. He made a little dent in it back when he was 7 and 8, when he was with other guardians. He'd started to process feelings, learn how to express himself, but that was interrupted when his mom took him back. And she took him to therapists a few times, but nothing was ever consistent. The traumatic events continued to accumulate while he was in his mother's care, accelerating the damage to his developing brain. Sean and Kassandra were not sure if they could actually meet Eric's needs. And at times they told professionals, this is too much, we can't keep him. They were particularly bothered by his habit of stealing food and keeping it in his room and lying about it. But they reconsidered. Sean didn't want his younger brother to feel abandoned yet again. They kept Eric because they wanted to help him. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to give him stability and love. But sometimes love is not enough. Eric did make progress again between 2019 and 2021. He had an excellent mental health worker named Lori from Lakes Region Behavioral Health. She visited twice a week and took Eric into the community. He often came into those sessions with Lori upset about punishment or complaining their expectations weren't fair. And she would talk him through it. She would guide him. She would say, was it really unfair? Are you maybe being a little bit of a jerk? Are you just used to not having any rules? Were they really being mean when they said, you have to empty the dishwasher right now? Or were they just exhausted because they had a baby and a toddler and 2 full-time jobs and they just wanted him to do his chores? And Eric just did not know how to function in a normal household. But he really appreciated that Lori would tell him like it is. She'd also sometimes gently intervene to help Sean and Kassandra, suggesting more defined punishments, clearer expectations, because they were just trying to figure it out too. And they were only 10 years older than Eric. Over and over, when you read these records, you can see Eric process his feelings with Lori. She would ask him when he came in, started this session, where are you at on a scale of 1 to 10? And he'd give her a number. And then at the end of the session, he'd say, oh, I feel better now. And they'd give a different number that was lower in terms of how elevated he felt. He'd always say, I feel better now that we talked about this. And Kassandra and Sean would tell Lori, we're so happy that you're working with him. He's better when he talks to you. When she would go on vacation, they would say, oh, he was a mess while you were gone. Lori also got Eric involved in the Boys and Girls Club. He started feeling a sense of pride in himself, a sense that he belonged in a community, and that was very important to a child who had never stayed in one place long enough to form lasting connections. And then once again, his progress was interrupted. And this time it was not because of his mother, and it wasn't because of anyone wishing anything bad or trying to do anything hurtful. It was simply because Sean and Kassandra bought a house in Northfield in a different county, a different mental health catchment area. And they did this not because they were trying to harm Eric. No, they just wanted a better place for their sons to grow up. They wanted a house with a yard instead of an apartment. And it took them a long time to find the house. It's always difficult to find a house. But they finally found one that they loved, that they could afford. And Eric could tell how excited they were. And although he was worried about moving away from those supports, he said, yeah, let's do it. But unfortunately, that had the effect of once again short-circuiting Eric's progress. He lost that supportive relationship with Lori. He could no longer go to the Boys and Girls Club after school. In Eric, we have a brain severely compromised by trauma, and he was also in the midst of the storm of puberty. He had guardians who were straddling the line between parents and siblings. Both of them were working full-time, raising 2 very young children, no childcare, and they were simultaneously trying to meet Eric's needs, the needs of a deeply traumatized adolescent. After the move, Eric fell into a depression. He had fits and starts of improvement. He was passing his classes in the fall of 2021, but then he got COVID in December. His grades dropped. Sean and Kassandra were upset. They grounded him indefinitely. And Lori wasn't there anymore to gently intervene or process with Eric to try to help him take some steps, get him back on track. He did have new counselors, but he just didn't connect with them in the same way. At this point, he'd had so many counselors over the years, so many different therapists. And the family settled into a standoff. Sean and Kassandra were angry with his behavior. They'd take privileges away. He would get angry. His immature brain would double down, say, why should I try? I'm going to not try, as though that would somehow punish Sean and Kassandra instead of ultimately punishing himself. In March, Sean and Kassandra asked the family court to terminate the guardianship. And Sean wrote, "I will not allow Eric to do something he cannot take back." Unfortunately, the court said no, and Eric stayed. The tension in the home and Eric's depression built until the June 2022 incident where he ran away and was subsequently hospitalized. Eric felt like he'd dug himself such a deep hole with Sean and Kassandra, he would never be able to climb out. He'd never be able to regain their trust. He wanted to start over. That's why he ran away originally. But really, that was not a realistic plan. He went to school the next morning. And when he came home from the hospital, things continued to deteriorate. He took Sean's power tools to build a fort. He left them out in the rain, ruining them. Eric made a crude weapon to imitate something he saw in The Walking Dead, and he left it outside, not thinking about the fact that his nephews could easily happen upon it. Sean and Kassandra were at their wits' end, understandably. They wanted Eric out of the house. Sean told police he was barely speaking to Eric. Eric did love his nephews, and he loved Sean and Kassandra. He was deeply grateful to them for taking him in. His time in the hospital helped him realize how lucky he was to be living there. He told his Riverbend worker that on August 27th, 2022, his 16th birthday. He told her how much he missed his nephews while in the hospital. That is Eric's history leading up to the day he shot Kassandra, Benjamin, and Mason. And what the state described to you was a premeditated murder, which is not what Eric pled guilty to. The state assumes that he brought that gun downstairs intending to shoot Kassandra, Benjamin, and Mason. They're discounting the possibility that he brought that gun downstairs with a different intention, like suicide. They're ignoring the possibility that something happened downstairs, perhaps someone saw the gun, and that Eric panicked. That version of events is also possible. We do not know what happened. Eric still cannot remember. We spent time explaining Eric's history because all of these facts are important to consider in the context of sentencing. Eric was 16 years old. When he came to live with Sean and Kassandra, he had spent 11 out of the past 13 years living in squalid, unsafe conditions. One of the things he often fought with Sean and Kassandra about was the fact that he would bring food to his room at night. And they said, "We understand why you did that, why he does that. It's because he didn't have enough to eat with his mother." But what they didn't understand was that his brain was deeply damaged by all of those years of food insecurity. His brain was telling him each night that he had to have food with him. He had to have it as a matter of survival. Those years Eric spent with his mother damaged his brain and impaired his development. He couldn't just flip a switch to erase a lifetime of lived experience and just be a normal kid. In Miller v. Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a sentencing court must take into account the fact that juvenile brains are not yet fully developed. Further, sentencing courts must consider a defendant's upbringing and weigh it more heavily than they would for an adult defendant. Miller was decided in 2012. Roper and Graham even earlier. Brain science has continued to advance since Miller. And now we'd wish to present testimony from Dr. Carrie Oyen regarding the effects of trauma on juvenile brain development.